Have you ever had anybody ask you as a Christian, why do you follow some rules of the Bible but not the others? Do you just pick and choose what you like? Like, why is it that you're against certain sexual sins, but you have no problem whatsoever with having lobster or having bacon? Right? Have you ever asked that question? Or have you ever wondered about it yourself? Why is it that if you go through the Old Testament, there's a bunch of laws in there that we still keep and that we like really fight for, and other laws that it's like, yeah, we don't do that anymore. And have you ever wondered why that's the case? I hope you have wondered why that's the case because it's an important question. If we believe the entire Bible is the Word of God, we should follow everything in it, right? And yet we don't. So why is that? Is it just simply that we follow the laws we like and we don't follow the laws we don't like? Is that all it is? Just a flip of the coin? No. Well, sadly, yes, sometimes that's what people do, but no, that's not how we should do it. And that's not how good Bible scholars do it. So that's a big part of what we're going to get into today in today's episode, which is why we read the Testaments differently. That's not going to be the entire subject matter for today because we're going to be looking at simply the Testaments and why we look at them differently. But a big part of why we as Christians follow some Old Testament laws and not other Old Testament laws, a lot of it has to do with the different ways that we read the Testaments. And we'll go into that. And hopefully by the end of this episode today, you'll have a clearer understanding of why, and then maybe tag it for later because it's one of those things you have to recall and remember and go back and see the notes on the next time you're faced with a question or the next time it comes up again in your own mind and you go, why was that? This may be one for you to tag. So let's take a look, first of all, at the differences between the Testaments. So many things change between the Old Testament and the New Testament. If you were reading the Testaments through for the first time and you stopped at the end of Malachi and then picked up Matthew, you would be struck with the huge difference between the two testaments. It's like you're reading two entirely different books from two entirely different religions, practically, and in some ways, kind of. Well, you are. A couple examples, for instance, in the Old Testament, salvation is like a wall that keeps people out. Salvation is for the Jews, and that's all. New Testament, salvation is an open door. Everybody come on in. Right? Big change. In the Old Testament, no one gets quote unquote saved or even says, what must I do to be saved? But in the New Testament, it's all about that. Right? In the Old Testament, there's little or no concern about heaven or hell. Even when they talk about dying, it's about going down to the grave. Heaven and hell don't factor in, whereas in the New Testament, heaven and hell are talked about constantly, starting with Jesus. Okay, big shift. In the Old Testament, the Jewish people are constantly falling back into idol worship. In the New Testament, it just doesn't happen. It's not a part of their life. And same thing with polygamy. Old Testament, multiple wives by multiple men of God. New Testament, no, it just does not happen. Not just it doesn't just not happen for Christians. It doesn't happen for the Jewish people either. It's a complete change from the Old to New Testament. In the Old Testament, nobody quote shares their faith. In fact, like we talked about earlier, it's really a wall. In the New Testament, it's a command. We call it the Great Commission. Jesus, in all four Gospels and Acts, is quoted as saying that we are to share our faith with others. That just didn't happen in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, they're told to defeat their enemies, and at times, really hard for us to understand, make sure everybody dies, including all the women and children. It's like, just like, oh, how do we even reconcile that with a loving God? But in the New Testament, from Jesus, it's love your enemies, turn the other cheek, go the extra mile, take up your cross, right? It's completely different. In the Old Testament, a relationship with God belongs only to the Jews. If you want to get into a relationship with God, you've got to become a Jew first. In the New Testament, a relationship with God is open up to everyone, Jew and Gentile. There is no difference between us at all. So, what is going on here? Why is there such a dramatic change? Well, one of the things that might come easily to mind is, well, there's a big gap. There's like 400-year gap between Malachi and Matthew. So, in that period of time, a whole bunch of stuff changed. And yeah, that's true. It was a watershed period of human history, unquestionably. Um, the rise of Greek and Roman culture, Alexander the Great, all kinds of things happened during that season of time. It is literally by historians considered the great watershed of human history. But it's not a long passage of time. There is far more passage of time between Genesis and Malachi, like thousands and thousands of years between Genesis and Malachi, and only 400 years between Malachi and Matthew. So it's not so you because of that you should see a lot more difference between Genesis and Malachi than you see between Malachi and Matthew, but you don't. There are progressions, there are changes in the way people perceive God and behave, obviously between Genesis and Malachi, quite a few, but it's not nearly as big a progression in understanding of who God is as we get between Malachi and Matthew. So why is that? Well, let's take a look at it. And we're just going to lay a bunch of things out for you, put the Old Testament and the New Testament side by side here, and we're going to talk about some of the differences between them. The first and biggest difference, and really the difference that changes everything about it for us as Christians, especially, is the Old Testament was written before Jesus, the New Testament was written after Jesus. So everything in the Old Testament is in anticipation and expectation of who Jesus would be, but without really knowing who Jesus was going to be. So while God knew what he was saying through the prophets themselves didn't know it as they were writing it down. So it was much more obscure. In the New Testament, everything in the New Testament was written after Jesus' life, death, burial, resurrection, and ascension. All the New Testament was written after all that had happened. So it was written with a much clearer understanding of what was going on. So that changes everything about the way the New Testament was written. In addition to that, well, in fact, here's an illustration of how that's laid out. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 1 through 2 says this. In the past, that would be Old Testament, from the time this was written. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through prophets at many times and in various ways. So Old Testament came at many times and in various ways, right? From a burning bush, from a talking donkey, from handwriting on the wall, from a bunch of angels showing up, from a stairway to heaven, right? All kinds of different ways that God showed up and talked to his people. So in the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. That's a big difference, isn't it? Right? So in the Old Testament, from all these different places, different sources. In the New Testament, we get everything through an understanding of the life, the teachings, the death, the resurrection, and the ascension of Jesus. So it's not that the New Testament is more inspired than the Old Testament, because remember that our foundational verse for the series is this: all scripture is God breathed, Old and New Testament. And it's useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness, so that the servant of God may be thoroughly equipped for every good work. So it's not that the Old Testament is less inspired or the New Testament is more inspired. It's simply that we have a greater understanding, and so a more direct access to the truth of who Jesus is when somebody's writing after Jesus showed up compared to when they were writing before Jesus showed up. So with that in mind, and going back to the previous verse from Hebrews, in the past in the Old Testament, God could speak to them through any venue he chose to. And today he can speak to us through multiple venues, but all of it is filtered through the life, teachings, death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus. In the New Testament, in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. Everything we understand today is filtered through the lens of Jesus. Back then, it could come any way, and it did come in all kinds of different ways imaginable. From the tabernacle, from the trumpets that were given for the tabernacle, from the mountains on fire to right, for tablets of stone to right, multiple ways, multiple times, multiple prophets. Everything today is filtered through Jesus. That is by far the biggest change. So yes, both Old Testament and New Testament are equally God breathed, but as we saw at the end of last week's session, they apply differently than in our lives because we have a different understanding of who Jesus is. Okay, so in the past, many times, various ways. In the last days, it will always be by his Son. Now, what else? What other differences do we have? Old Testament was written in Hebrew. We don't see this as obviously because we're reading it through English translations. But if we were to pick up the original languages, what we would understand is the Old Testament is written in Hebrew, the New Testament is written in Greek. Both of them have a little Aramaic sprinkling in there, and that's because of cultural reasons through the Babylonian captivity and so on that we would go in another history lesson, because there's a lot of complications in that. But just bits and pieces of Aramaic sprinkled in here and there. But the Old Testament written in Hebrew, New Testament written in Greek. That also changes our understanding of things, because Hebrew and Greek are very, very different languages that use words in very, very different ways. So true biblical scholars will study both of those languages and try to become proficient in both of those languages to get an understanding and to be able to compare the testaments to each other. Thirdly, The Old Testament was written to a single nation, to one nation, to people of one nation. The New Testament was written to people of all nations. This is partially reflected in the languages that they chose. The Hebrew was really only spoken by Jews. Nobody other than Jews really ever spoke Hebrew. But Greek became the language of all learned people in Western civilization at that time. So if you were a Jew or a Roman or any other ethnic background, but you wanted to read the scholarly works, you learned Greek. Greek was the language that people wrote scholarly works in. So it was like a universal language at the time, much like English is a universal language today. Like if you're going to be an airline pilot, learn English because it's the universal language for all airline pilots everywhere, right? Greek was that way then. So Hebrew was a small language spoken only by a small group of people because the message was only for them. New Testament written in Greek because it was written for everybody. Okay, so to one nation, to all nations. And so we have to recognize that as we're reading it. When we read the Old Testament, yes, it does apply to us. Yes, it is God breathed, but it has to apply to us through a much narrower filter of understanding this was originally written not for everybody all over the world, but for a very specific and small group of people at a very specific time and place. So we have to filter through that. How we filter that we'll come up with in a little while. Another difference between Old and New Testament is this. In the Old Testament, here, I'm sorry. Before we get to that, here's a passage that talks about really these three that are up on the screen. You are a letter from Christ, 2 Corinthians 3:3. You are a letter from Christ, the result of our ministry, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. So this is the Apostle Paul talking to the Corinthians and telling them that the Spirit of God has written his word in their hearts, and it's instead of on tablets of stone. So this idea of tablets of stone written in Hebrew, written before Jesus, written to a single nation has changed. And now everybody's heart is open to receive the message of God through salvation, but again, all filtered through Jesus. All right, here's another difference then. The Old Testament was about keeping sinners out. The word holiness is the primary word that is used for our relationship with God. He is a holy God and we are to remain holy before him. And holy means separate. So everything in the Old Testament is written through the lens of separation, separating out the holy from the unholy. We have to remember that when we read the Old Testament. In the New Testament, it's about bringing sinners in, not about keeping sinners out. The gospel means good news, and it means good news for everyone. So those are two completely different approaches. When you read the Old Testament, you have to recognize, you have to understand, put it through the filter of this is about a small persecuted group of people who were chosen to be God's people to bring his message to the world. And they were called to be holy, separate, not intermarry, not intermix their religious ideas, not even go out and try to convert other people. It's completely about holiness and about separateness. And then Jesus comes in and he goes, go share this with everybody. Bring everybody into the tent. I want everybody to be mine. Now you have to come in through the gate of salvation. Christ is the only way in. So it's not universalist, but it's open to everybody. They want to bring sinners in so that they're not sinners anymore, so that they get saved. That's the good news of the gospel. So two completely different approaches. So we have to apply that filter to it depending on which verses we're reading. Okay. Next, in the Old Testament, God was distant. In the New Testament, the Holy Spirit lives in us. Okay, big difference. Well, here's the verse we saw earlier. I'd put it in the wrong place earlier, so now we'll read it in a place where it applies more. 2 Corinthians 3:3. You are a letter from Christ, the result of our ministry, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human heart. So in the Old Testament, God was distant on tablets of stone. You had to go to the temple. You had to go into the Ark of the Covenant where nobody was allowed except for one priest once a year to even see the Ten Commandments. It was that distance from people. Only one person one time a year was allowed into the room where the Ten Commandments existed. That's how distant God was from them. And now he says, I'm writing this on your heart. You're going to carry it with you wherever you go. The Holy Spirit lives in you. Big difference. Okay. In the Old Testament, one more comparison here, one of maybe two or three. I think, no, this will be our last one for now. In the Old Testament, there's an emphasis on obeying the law. In the New Testament, the emphasis is on God's grace. The Old Testament does not lack God's grace, and the New Testament does not do without God's law, but the emphasis in the old is law. The emphasis in the new is grace. Here's an interesting way it's contrasted. Matthew 5, verses 19 and 20. Therefore, anyone who sets aside any of the least of these commands, this is Jesus speaking, and he's talking about the commandments in the Old Testament. Anyone who sets aside the least of these commands, if you break even the smallest commandment and teaches others accordingly, you will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. Take a look at that last verse, verse 20. It's really important. Unless you keep the law better than the people who made it their entire life business to keep the law, the Pharisees and teachers of the law, if you don't keep the law better than them, you don't get into the kingdom of heaven if you're doing it the Old Testament way. The Old Testament way is if you break even a single one, you're out. It's about holiness. One mistake, you're out. Right? And then, as hard as that seems, it gets even harder. The Apostle Paul in Galatians 2:21 says, I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness could be gained through the law, Christ died for nothing. The Apostle Paul says, not only are, if you're going to live it the Old Testament way, if you break a single law, you're out. And then the Apostle Paul says, that's why I want to live by the grace of God, because why would Christ die if I could do it by myself? Right? If I could gain righteousness by keeping the law, there's no reason for Jesus to die. Just perfect people get in and that's it. But there are no perfect people. Jesus had to die in order to bring grace to us because nobody can make it in by keeping the law. It's the only way we can make it. That's why we need grace. Okay. So do we still need to behave ourselves? Yeah, sure. Because there's a higher moral law, and we're going to talk about now the differences. Why do we keep some laws and don't keep others? First of all, law keeping will not save you. Law keeping will not give you salvation. Never did, never will. But after we do get saved and we want to follow Jesus, the Bible is a great instructional plan on how to follow Jesus best. But then again, simple question, but a very valid question. How do I know which laws to keep and which laws not to keep? So let's walk through some of the differences between the Old and New Testament, and it'll help us understand why certain Old Testament laws we keep and some we don't. First of all, there were three types of laws in the Old Testament: ceremonial laws, judicial laws, and moral laws. Now, let me walk you through what each of those three mean, and then we'll talk about why they're hard to distinguish. First of all, ceremonial laws. These are laws having to do with what the priests did at the temple, or about how you had to wash yourself before you ate, or how you would separate yourself if you had touched a dead body, or those kinds of the things. Okay, ceremonial laws, and some of them are about cleaning, and some of them are about being sanitary, and so on. But there are the ceremonial laws, mostly to do with the temple and mostly to do with Old Testament worship. Ceremonial laws would include animal sacrifices, for instance. Okay, there are also judicial laws, sometimes called civil laws, and these are the laws that were meant for their nation. So today we have a real clear distinction between laws that we follow for our religion and laws that we're required to follow as a member of civil society, right? Like the speed limit has nothing to do with religion. It's a civil law, right? But not cussing or not drinking too much, right? That's something that we might keep as a Christian, to say, I'm going to keep this behavior in my life because I want to reflect the character of Christ within my body and within my speech, right? But nobody's going to take you off and haul you off to jail for cussing, right? That because it's not about the civil law. It's about it's about a religious law. So they had ceremonial laws about the temple. They had judicial laws that applied to, for instance, if you stole and you were caught, then you had to bring back 3 goats for every 1 goat you stole, or whatever. That's not an exact equation, but right, it has to deal with goats and sheaves of grain and those kinds of things. Like, you read it and you go, that doesn't apply to us because we don't live in that kind of culture anymore. Okay, so the judicial or civil laws. And then thirdly, there's the moral laws, and those are the laws that have to do with essential, fundamental human behavior that never changes. So why is it so challenging to distinguish between the three of them? Here's why. In the Old Testament, they were all three intermixed. You can literally, in the Old Testament, have one verse that gives a ceremonial law, have a next verse in the same chapter talk about judicial law, and have another verse in the same chapter give you a moral law. The moral law we're supposed to keep. The ceremonial and judicial laws we can learn something from, but we're not required to keep anymore. And they're all in the same chapter. Why didn't they lay them out? Why didn't God say, okay, here's the judicial law book, here's a ceremonial law book, and here's a moral law book? Why did God not do that? Because at the time when they were written, the Jewish people had to keep all three. Right? There wasn't a division between I'm going to keep some laws and not others. No, if you're a Jew living in Israel in the Old Testament, you had to keep all three, so that there was no reason to separate them out. As Christians, that changed. And there are some Old Testament laws we're no longer required to keep. And here, let me walk you through what they are and why, so that you'll see it's not random. We are now, as Christians, no longer required to keep, first of all, Old Testament laws that are ceremonial. Again, the ceremonial laws have to do with the temple, with worship, sacrificing animals, for instance. Now, why do we no longer sacrifice animals? Because Jesus died as the ultimate sacrifice. And the New Testament tells us really clearly, because he died, we don't need to sacrifice animals anymore. Every Old Testament animal that was sacrificed in anticipation of the ultimate sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. So once Jesus is on the cross and he's suffered and he's crucified and he's resurrected, it's done. My sins are forgiven. I don't need to sacrifice animals as a substitute anymore, because Jesus already died as the ultimate substitute. Therefore, everything that has to do with religious ceremony that happened before Jesus, all of it was in anticipation of Jesus. Once Jesus has arrived, none of the other ceremonies are required for us anymore. So here are a couple subcategories of ceremonial laws. There are some ceremonial laws, for instance, that are situation specific. If there's a law that talks about what the priests are supposed to do in the temple, well, if there are no priests and no temple, those laws don't apply to us anymore, right? And there are no priests and no temple. There has not been a temple since 70 AD. A lot of churches are called temples or whatever. We're talking specifically about the designated Jewish temple. There has been no Jewish temple in Jerusalem since 70 AD. Therefore, there have been no priests to worship or to serve in the temple in Jerusalem. So even the Jews understand this, the laws that apply to priests in the temple don't apply until there is a temple and priests in it, right? So there are a lot of laws, when you look at it, you go, oh, but I don't live in that environment anymore, so that doesn't apply to me. So there are some that are situation specific. But also, here's one we referenced earlier about eating bacon or eating shrimp or eating lobster, right? The dietary laws don't apply to us anymore. Here's why. In the New Testament, they are specifically overturned. Matthew chapter 15, verse 11, Jesus said this: what goes into someone's mouth does not defile them, but what comes out of their mouth, that is what defiles them. And in context, he is talking about the food we eat, in addition to other things, but that as well. Maybe even more strongly, and I won't put it up here because it's long, but in Acts chapter 10, Peter on a roof has a vision. 3 times a sheet comes down, and on that sheet are all the forbidden animals that he's not supposed to eat. But a voice from heaven says, take these up and eat them. And each time Peter goes, I'm not going to do that. He thinks it's a temptation from the devil. So finally, the third time, God says, don't call unclean what I'm calling clean. And right there, God literally in a vision to Peter says, you can eat whatever animals you want to eat from this point on. Right. So that's a very direct and significant change. All right. So now the amount that we eat still matters. Drunkenness is still a sin. It's declared so in the New Testament. Gluttony is still a sin. It is declared so in the New Testament. But what we eat isn't a sin. How much we eat, you can't be a glutton, you can't be a drunk. That's still different because that's part of the moral law. So those are some of the reasons why. So when people say, hey, why are you okay eating bacon? The Bible says you can't have pig. Well, because the New Testament, and we are Christians and we live in a New Testament world, the New Testament specifically overturned that. And we'll talk about the overturning of laws in a moment as well. So ceremonial laws, we don't have to worry about anymore, because all of those ceremonies were fulfilled by Jesus. And so they don't have to be fulfilled. They don't have to be done by us anymore, because they were done in anticipation of Jesus. Secondly, we don't have to fulfill the civil or the judicial laws, because those laws were for their nation and for their time. The only people who have to obey the Old Testament judicial or civil laws are people who lived in Israel in the Old Testament. They were for that specific time. The legals, the civil laws, not the ceremonial ones, not the religious ones, not the moral ones, but the ones that were very clearly and specifically for that period of time and for their laws in that specific nation. For instance, you got to pay a certain amount of grain or a shekel, right? We don't have shekels anymore. So anything to do with shekels. Now, does that mean we don't learn something from them? No, there's a balance and a weight to them that matters today, and that has served to help us understand what just laws are. Absolutely. So we can still learn from the principles behind them, but we don't have to keep them. And we also don't have to keep any laws that were fulfilled or changed by Jesus. We've talked about this already, but let's underline it. Fulfilled. All Old Testament sacrifices have been fulfilled by Jesus as the Passover lamb. And the New Testament declares really clearly Jesus is now the Passover lamb. He is the last sacrifice. He is our high priest. He is the only person we need to go through to get to God. Because we only have one high priest, Jesus. He's the only one who brings us to God. We don't need other priests. Because he is our ultimate sacrifice, we don't need other sacrifices. Because he is our Passover lamb, we no longer need to sacrifice a lamb during Passover. So anything that was fulfilled by Jesus, we don't have to do anymore. Secondly, anything that was changed by Jesus, right? Jesus, there's a bunch of spots, for instance, in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, 6, 7, and so on, where Jesus says, "You've heard that it was said, but I say unto you." He is there specifically saying, in the Old Testament, you're supposed to do this, but I'm changing it, and now you got to do this. And in many ways, he actually makes it harder to fulfill when he's talking about moral laws. But anything that Jesus changes, Sabbath, for instance, why don't we worship Jesus? Why is our Sabbath not sundown Friday to sundown Saturday, which it is for the Jews and which a lot of people today still observe? Because Jesus specifically said that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. And Paul later on talks in several places about don't worry about specific dates and times and months. That's not what this is about anymore. So should we observe a Sabbath? Yes, it's in the Ten Commandments, and the Ten Commandments still apply because they're all moral laws. A day of rest out of 7? Yes. Does it matter that it's sundown Friday to sundown Saturday? No. Right? Because one is a moral law about making sure that people aren't working 7 days a week. And the other one is ceremonial about a specific time to a specific time. So we don't have to worry about that. The things that were fulfilled or changed by Jesus, we don't have to worry about. And again, the best place to get started on that is go to Matthew 5 and 6, and you'll see where Jesus in several times says a phrase like, you used to do it this way, now you need to do it this way. He very clearly does that. All right. Now, what Old Testament laws are we required to keep? Because we don't just toss the whole Old Testament out. Not at all. 10 Commandments, like I said, still apply. So we are required to keep Old Testament laws that meet certain requirements. And here are some of those requirements. First of all Old Testament laws that stand on universal moral principles, right? You don't even have to be a believer in Jesus to understand that murder is wrong, that stealing is wrong, that killing is wrong, right? There are Old Testament laws that are universal moral principles that simply apply to how we care for our fellow human being and how we express our love to God. They are universal. So we keep the universal moral principles. Secondly, anything that's not changed in the New Testament. If there's a law in the Old Testament that has not been overturned in the New Testament, and all ceremonial laws have, and all judicial and civil laws have, but if you go, okay, that was in the Old Testament and there's no reason to drop it in the New Testament, then we keep it. For instance, like I said earlier, every single, here we go to the next one. Or even more clear, anything that's reaffirmed in the New Testament, we need to keep. Every single one of the 10 Commandments is reaffirmed in the New Testament. Did you know that? Every single one. So that's why the 10 Commandments still stand so strong for us today. Even though it was written in the Old Testament, every one of them is confirmed in the New. The idea that we observe a Sabbath is confirmed in the New Testament. Okay, and where would we go? Oh, there we go. And then the last one is this: we have to fulfill all Old Testament laws that are essential to love God and others. Because when Jesus was asked, "What's the greatest commandment?" they were trying to trick him into, "Oh, he says this one, but some other group says that one." They were trying to divide the crowd, and Jesus, as he always did, brilliantly sidestepped their trivial question and got to the heart of the matter. And what he said was, the most important commandment is this: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. We now call that the great commandment. So if there's an Old Testament law that is required for us to do to love God, right? Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Honor your father and mother. Have no other gods before me. How can I say I love God if I have other gods before him? Right? I have to observe that commandment because it expresses my love to God. I can't be loving God if I have other gods before him. Can I say I love my neighbor if I'm coveting my neighbor's stuff? No, I can't. That's not a loving attitude to have towards my neighbor. So any Old Testament law that I have to keep in order to, because if I don't keep it, I'm not loving God or I'm not loving my neighbor, that I have to keep as well. Everything in the New Testament is ordered by love of God first, by love of others second. And Jesus put it really clearly: if you love me, you will do what I command. So hopefully that gives you a good idea. You may have to go through that again because there's a lot in there. But I think now, hopefully, you see that when Christians observe some Old Testament laws but don't observe other Old Testament laws, it's not just simply flipping a coin, or it's not just simply what I feel like at the moment, or it's not random. We have very specific, very clear rules that we follow to determine which Old Testament laws apply to us today and which ones do not. And hopefully, by having seen this now, you have an understanding. Even if you may look at it and go, well, I'm not quite sure I follow the logic or agree with it, at least you now know there is a basis of logic to it. It's not random, it has rules that we have to follow. And when you look at them, I think for most reasonable people, we look at them and go, oh, that makes sense. I get now why we follow certain laws and not others. So hopefully that helps you as you continue to try to do the great commandment of loving God and loving others. Now, next week, we're going to take a look at why do we start with a book rather than with a verse when we want to study the Bible well. It's a really important thing about the overall most important principle of biblical interpretation, which is context. The most important number one rule of biblical interpretation, reading, and studying is context. That's why we start with a book rather than starting with a verse. We'll get into the details of that next week. I think it's going to be, again, one of the key things that's going to help you every time you read the Bible from now on. I hope today helped as well. We'll see you next time. Bye.